All right, buckle up. Let's kick things off with the story of Albert Fish and step into a world where the dark shadows still mess with people's heads today. This is a true story, the story of a man known as the Kind Old Man. But behind that face, there was a monster hiding, turning real nightmares into reality. On a regular day in 1928, a family in New York got a letter that shook them to their core. A letter where every single word was dripping with terror. A letter that spelled out the fate of their little girl. A letter from a man who thought he was a damn saint. This man was Albert Fish, an old man who was a wolf in sheep's clothing. But this story ain't just about one crime. This story talks about decades of torture, murder, and deviance that had its roots in his childhood. A childhood that started with pain and trauma and ended with a monster that even the judges and psychiatrists were horrified to hear confess. So after this intro, let me tell you, in this video, you're gonna get to know every single detail of Albert Fish's life, from his childhood, full of torture and abuse, to the moments he became a serial killer. You're gonna hear how he hunted innocent kids, how he killed them, and how he wrote letters to families where every single word was pure poison. We're gonna cover the story of his arrest, his interrogations, and the moment justice finally caught up with his ass. This story is for people who want to know the truth, even if the truth is bitter and dark as hell. So stick with me, because this trip into darkness ain't gonna be a walk in the park. Albert Fish was born on May 19th, 1870, in Washington, D.C. His real name was Hamilton Howard Fish, but later on, he changed his own name to Albert. He had bad luck from the get-go. His father, Randall Fish, was 75 years old when Albert was born. And when Albert was only 5, his old man died. His mother, Ellen Fish, couldn't handle taking care of him and his siblings. So she shipped Albert off to an orphanage in Washington. But this orphanage wasn't a safe place. It was a place where kids grew up with violence and torture. Albert later told stories about how at the orphanage, the attendants would whip the kids, and he got punished pretty much every week. But the weird thing was, Albert got used to these whippings, and he even started enjoying them. He said when he got whipped, he felt excitement and sexual arousal. In 1879, when Albert was 10 years old, his mother got remarried and was able to get him out of the orphanage. But the damage that was done to him couldn't be fixed. Albert wasn't a normal kid anymore. He'd turned into a boy with violent fantasies and sexual deviance. He started doing weird stuff, like going to public bathrooms and staring at the walls, or thinking about bizarre fantasies at night. He even started eating his own because he thought it gave him some kind of power. When Albert hit his teens, his love life was completely messed up. He started having relationships with boys his own age when he was 12, and these relationships were always violent and strange. He said that's when he started getting into torturing and hurting other people. Albert later confessed that even back in his teenage years, He was having his first experiences with sexual violence. In 1890, Albert turned 20 and moved to New York. He got a job there as a house painter. This gig let him go into different people's houses, and that made it easier for him to find his victims. Around the same time, Albert got married. He married a woman named Anna Marie Hoffman and had 6 kids with her. From the outside, Albert looked like a regular guy, a family man working to put food on the table. But behind that face, Albert was turning into a monster. Throughout his marriage, Albert showed some seriously strange behavior. He was into torturing himself. He'd stick needles into his own body, especially around his pelvis and between his legs. He'd even soak cotton in alcohol, shove it up his own ass, and set it on fire. This behavior showed he had some major mental issues, but nobody noticed. His wife, Anna, didn't know about this stuff at first, but when she found out, she got scared and finally left him. This happened in 1917, and after that, Albert was completely alone. His being alone gave him more room to hunt for victims. But why did Albert turn out like this? What made him go from a damaged kid to a full-blown serial killer? The answer is a combo of a few things. First, the childhood trauma. The torture he went through in the orphanage made him link pain with sexual pleasure. Second, the mental disorders that were probably in his blood. A lot of the Fish family members had mental illnesses. One of his brothers was in a mental asylum, and one of his sisters had delusions. Third, the society Albert lived in. In the early 1900s, stuff like mental illness or sexual deviance was taboo, and nobody talked about it. So nobody helped Albert. Nobody figured out he needed treatment. Albert hit his peak in the 1920s, when he was in his 50s. He wasn't just sticking to torturing himself anymore. He was looking for other victims. His victims were mostly children, kids who were vulnerable and easy to trick. Albert looked for poor kids, kids from broken homes, kids nobody would come looking for. Oh, Albert later said he traveled to 23 US states and found a victim everywhere he went. He confessed that he probably abused at least 100 kids and maybe killed 15 of them. But the real number of his victims was never figured out. The cops could only confirm a few cases, but Albert kept saying the real number was higher. Albert had his own special ways of hunting his victims. He usually looked for kids who were alone on the street, or kids whose families were poor and needed money. Albert presented himself as a kind, fatherly man. He wore clean clothes, had a white beard, and had a face you could trust. The kids and their families trusted him, and that's the trust Albert took advantage of. All through the 1920s, Albert traveled to different places. He'd answer job ads in the papers or put ads out himself. He usually looked for families who had a teenage son or daughter looking for work. Albert would pretend he wanted to hire them, and when he went to their house, he'd trick them. He'd tell them he had a good job for them, or that he wanted to take them to a party. The families who needed the money and trusted Albert's kind-looking face would let their kids go with him. But after that, they'd never see those children again. Albert's life in these years was totally split in two. On one side, he was a father living with his own kids, and on the other side, he was a hunter of children. His own kids never knew what he was really like. They knew him as a normal dad, even though they sometimes saw him do weird things. Albert seemed to have the ability to keep his two lives separate, and that's what made him even more dangerous. He could be a regular guy by day and a monster by night. During this time, Albert also got into some really strange religious beliefs. He believed God was ordering him to kill children. He said he could hear God's voice, and this voice told him to do it to save the children from sin. These beliefs showed that Albert was having auditory hallucinations, a disorder linked to schizophrenia. But Albert never went looking for treatment because he thought the voices were real. And just like that, in the 1920s, Albert Fish became one of the most dangerous serial killers in America without anybody even noticing. He moved easily from one city to another, found his victims, and then disappeared. This period of his life was when his dark shadows ruined the lives of hundreds of families forever. Now that you're familiar with Albert Fish's background, let's step into the darkest parts of his story. Places that would terrify even the bravest of people. The first crime that Albert Fish committed, and that the police were able to confirm, happened in 1924. His victim was an 8-year-old boy named Francis McDonnell. The story goes that in the summer of 1924, Albert went to a small town in New York State called Staten Island. There, he found a poor family who had several sons. Albert introduced himself as a man looking for workers, and he told Francis's parents that he wanted to hire their son to help on his farm. The family, who were in desperate need of money, agreed. Albert arranged to take Francis with him the next day. But the next day, Francis didn't come home. His family got worried and searched for him, but they couldn't find any trace of him. Albert was gone too. He had disappeared, and he had taken Francis with him. A few days later, Francis's body was found in a forest. His body had been horribly tortured. Albert had strangled him, and then he had cut his body into pieces with a knife. But what was even more horrifying was that Albert had taken parts of Francis's body with him. Albert later confessed that he had taken Francis to an empty house where no one was around. He had told Francis they were going to the farm, but when they got to the house, Francis realized something was wrong. Francis asked. Albert pulled a knife out of his pocket, and when Francis saw it, he started crying. He begged, "Please, mister, I want to go home. My mom is waiting for me." Albert said in a soft voice, "Don't worry, everything will be over very soon." And after that, Albert strangled Francis. He later said that Francis struggled for a few minutes, but eventually, his movements stopped. After Francis's death, Albert cut his body into pieces with the knife. He took parts of his body with him, and over the course of a few days, he cooked and ate them. Albert said that Francis's flesh tasted good, and the act made him feel powerful. This was the first murder that the police could link to Albert. But Albert said it wasn't his first murder. He had killed other children before this, but their bodies were never found. After Francis's murder, Albert continued with his normal life. He returned to New York and went back to his work as a house painter. No one suspected him because he seemed like a kind old man. But in his mind, he was already planning for his next victim. A few years later, in 1927, Albert found another victim. This time, it was a 4-year-old girl named Billy Gaffney. Billy was playing in the street when Albert saw her. He thought to himself that this was a good opportunity. Albert went up to Billy and started talking to her. He told Billy he wanted to play a game with her. Billy, an innocent child, trusted him. Albert took Billy's hand and said, "Come with me. I want to show you a nice place." Billy asked, "Where are we going?" Albert said, "A very good place. A place that has ice cream." Billy, who loved ice cream, went with him. But they didn't go anywhere with ice cream. Albert took Billy to an empty house, the same place he had taken Francis. When they got there, Billy started crying because she realized something was wrong. She said, "I want to go to my mom." Albert calmed her down and said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. You'll go soon." But then, Albert killed Billy. He cut her body into pieces, just like Francis, and he took parts of her with him. The police never found Billy's complete body, and her family waited for years to find out what had happened to their daughter. Albert never told them where Billy was, and this lack of knowledge tortured the family even more. But Albert Fish's most horrific crime was the murder of Grace Budd, a 10-year-old girl who was killed in 1928. This was the crime that finally exposed Albert because, several years later, he wrote a letter to Grace's family detailing every aspect of the murder. The story of Grace goes that in May 1928, Albert saw a help-wanted ad in the newspaper placed by a young man named Edward Budd. Edward was 18 and looking for work. Albert went to the address in the ad and met the Budd family. He introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer looking for workers. He told the Budd family he wanted to hire Edward to work on his farm. The Budds, a poor family, were interested in the offer. Albert visited their home several times and talked with them. On a day in June 1928, Albert went back to the Budd family's home. He told them he wanted to take Grace to a party at his sister's house. He said his sister was having a birthday party and there would be lots of kids there. The Budd family, who trusted Albert completely, allowed Grace to go with him. Grace's mother asked, "Mr. Howard, are you sure Grace will be back tonight?" Albert said with a kind smile, Absolutely, ma'am. I'll bring her back myself. Don't worry, we'll only be a few hours, and then we'll come back. Grace, who was excited, took Albert's hand and said, "Mom, I want to go. I really want to go to the party." Her mother looked at her hesitantly, but finally agreed. Grace put on her best dress and left with Albert. This was the last time the Budd family saw Grace alive. Albert took Grace on a train. They went to a station north of New York, and then they walked towards an empty house. This house was in a remote area, a place where no one would hear screams. Along the way, Grace started to get worried. She asked, "Mister, where's the party? Is it very far?" Albert said, "No, sweetheart, it's very close. We just have to walk a little more." When they got to the house, Grace saw that there was no party. The house was empty, cold, and dark. Grace got scared and said, "There's no one here. You said there was a party." Albert grabbed her hand tightly and said, "Come inside. The kids are in the house." But when they entered, Grace realized she had been tricked. She started crying and said, "I want to go home. Please take me to my mom." Albert took her upstairs to a room where the windows were covered with boards. He told Grace to look at the flowers in the garden. And when Grace looked outside, Albert started taking his clothes off. When Grace turned around and saw him, she screamed. She shouted, "What are you doing? I want to leave." Albert said in a soft voice that was more terrifying than a scream, "You're not going anywhere." Grace tried to run, but Albert grabbed her. He strangled Grace, and the little girl struggled for a few minutes, but eventually her movements stopped. After Grace's death, Albert cut her body into pieces with a knife. He took parts of her body with him, and over the course of 9 days, he cooked and ate them. Albert later said in his confessions, "Grace's flesh was very tender and delicious. I cooked a part of it every day with vegetables and spices and ate it. I had never eaten anything so good." These confessions were so horrific that even the psychiatrists and judges who spoke with him couldn't believe a human could be so cruel. The Budd family waited for Grace to return, but she never did. They informed the police, and an investigation began. The police looked for a man named Frank Howard, but no one by that name was found. Albert had disappeared again, taking the secret of Grace's death with him. 6 years passed, and the Budd family still didn't know what had happened to their daughter. But in November 1934, a letter arrived at their home that revealed the whole truth. This letter was from Albert Fish, and every word of it dripped with horror. The letter began, "Dear Mrs. Budd, I want to tell you what happened to your daughter, Grace. Back in 1894, a friend of mine was a sailor and he went to China. There was a famine there, and people were dying of hunger. They were selling children's flesh, and my friend tried it there. When he came back, he told me that a child's flesh is much tastier than anything else. I decided to try it myself." The letter went on to recount the horrific details of Grace's murder. Albert wrote about how he took Grace to the empty house, how he killed her, and how he cut her body into pieces. He even wrote about which parts of Grace's body he ate and how he cooked them. At the end of the letter, Albert wrote, "Grace died a virgin. I didn't touch her. I just killed her and ate her. Her flesh was very delicious." When Grace's mother read this letter, she fainted. Grace's father took the letter to the police, and the investigation started again. This time, the police had a clue. The envelope had a company logo on it, and through that, the police were able to find the sender. Detective William King was in charge of the Budd case, a man who had been searching for Grace for 6 full years. When he saw the letter, he knew it was the biggest clue he had ever had. He began examining the envelope. On the envelope was the logo of a private company located in Manhattan. King went to the company and asked the employees if anyone had taken these envelopes. One employee said, "Yes, a while ago, an old man came here and took a few envelopes. He said he wanted to write letters. I gave them to him because I thought he was harmless." King asked, "What was his name? What did he look like?" The employee said, "I don't remember his name, but he was an old man with a white beard, thin, with gray eyes. He was very polite." This description matched the man the Budd family had seen. King began investigating the area around the workplace and asked homeless people and workers if they had seen such a man. One of them said, "Yes, an old man fitting that description lives in a rented house a few blocks away. I think his name was Albert something." King immediately went to that address. He surveilled the house for several days, and finally, in December 1934, he saw Albert Fish returning home. King and several other officers waited for Albert to enter, then knocked on the door. Albert opened the door, and upon seeing the police, smiled. He said, "You're here for me." King said, "Are you Albert Fish?" Albert said, "Yes, that's me. You're here for Grace Budd, right?" King was shocked that Albert was confessing so easily. He said, "Yes, you sent a letter to the Budd family." Albert nodded and said, "Yes." King handcuffed Albert and arrested him. When they took Albert to the police station, he began recounting the details of his crimes without any resistance. He told them how he had killed Grace, how he had dismembered her body, and how he had eaten it. The detectives couldn't believe someone could be so cruel. But Albert didn't just confess to Grace's murder. He said he had killed at least 15 other children. He mentioned names and dates, and the police began investigating each of these cases. But many of the bodies were never found, and the victims' families were never able to bury their loved ones. The stories of Francis McDonnell and Billy Gaffney were also confirmed. Albert recounted the details of these crimes as well, saying he had done these things on God's orders. He said, "God told me to save these children, to purify them from sin. I was just carrying out God's orders." The police took him to jail and began further investigations. When they searched Albert's room, they found horrifying things. They found many letters that Albert had written to various families, letters detailing the murders. They also found torture instruments, various knives, needles, ropes, and items Albert had used to torture his victims. But the most terrifying thing they found was a box containing pictures of children. Albert had kept these pictures as souvenirs, mementos of his victims. Some of these children were identified, but many never were. The police also asked Albert why he had sent the letter to the Budd family. Albert said, "I wanted them to know. I wanted to cause them more pain. Seeing them suffer gave me pleasure. I knew this letter would get me caught, but it didn't matter anymore. I had done my work." These confessions showed that Albert was not only a serial killer, but also a psychological torturer who enjoyed the suffering of others. Other crimes Albert confessed to included the murder of a boy named Thomas Cadden, who disappeared in 1924. Albert said he had seen Thomas in a park in the Bronx and lured him with candy. He took Thomas to an empty house and killed him. Thomas's body was never found, and his family lived for years hoping for his return. Albert also confessed to the murder of a girl named Emma Richardson, who disappeared in 1926. He said he had seen Emma on the subway and lured her by saying he would take her to a toy store. Albert took Emma to the same empty house in northern New York where he had taken Grace. He killed Emma and buried her body in the woods. The police later went to that woods and found bones belonging to a child, but they couldn't confirm if they were Emma's. Albert said he usually chose children whom no one would look for. Poor children, homeless children, children who had run away from home. He knew that if these children disappeared, the police wouldn't search for them much. This was one of the reasons he was able to operate for years without being caught. But with Albert's arrest, other horrific stories also came to light. Some of his victims weren't children he had killed, but children he had abused and then released. These children later reported to the police and said a man matching Albert's description had tortured them. One of these victims was a boy named Daniel, who was tortured by Albert in 1929. Daniel said Albert had seen him in a park and lured him to a house with money. There, Albert stripped him and beat him with a belt. Daniel had managed to escape and report it to the police, but the police at the time couldn't find Albert. Now that Albert was arrested, Daniel was able to identify him. Another victim was a girl named Sarah, who was abused in 1931. Sarah said Albert had taken her from in front of her school and brought her to a basement. There, he tied her to a chair and pressed needles into her body. Sarah said Albert told her he would kill her if she screamed. Sarah remained silent, and after a few hours, Albert released her. Sarah had been so scared, she hadn't told anyone. But now that Albert was arrested, she found the courage and informed the police. These stories showed that Albert Fish was not only a killer, but also a professional torturer who enjoyed abusing children. He had done this for years and had managed to escape each time because no one suspected a kind old man. Albert Fish's arrest became major news across America. Newspapers called him the Brooklyn Vampire and the Brooklyn Monster. People couldn't believe that such a man had lived among them for years without anyone noticing. The families of the victims came to the police station to see if their missing children had been among Albert's victims. But the most horrific part of the story was the crimes Albert recounted after his arrest. He explained each murder in complete detail. He said one of his victims was a boy named Henry who disappeared in Delaware in 1927. Albert said he had seen Henry by the side of the road, a boy who was walking home. Albert pulled over and said, "Son, where are you going?" Henry said, "I'm going home, mister. It's getting late." Albert said, "If you want, I can give you a ride. My car is over there. You'll get there much faster." Henry, who was tired and had a long way to go, agreed. Albert took him to the car, but instead of taking him home, he drove to a remote road. When Henry realized something was wrong, he tried to jump out of the car, but Albert grabbed him. Henry shouted, "Where are you going? This isn't the way to my house." Albert said, "Quiet, boy. You're going to a safer place now." Albert took him to an old cabin in the woods. There he tortured Henry, playing with him for several hours, like a cat with a mouse. Finally, when he grew tired of the torture, he killed Henry. He buried Henry's body in the woods, and Henry's family never found out what had happened to him. Albert also confessed to the murder of a girl named Mary, who was killed in 1925. He said he had seen Mary at a train station. A girl who was waiting for her mother, Albert, approached her and said her mother had sent him to pick her up. Mary, who didn't know Albert, hesitated. Mary said, "When did my mom send you? I don't know you." Albert said, "Your mom is stuck at the store. She told me to come get you. She said she's in a real hurry." Mary, thinking maybe her mom really had sent him, went with Albert. But when they arrived and her mother wasn't there, Mary realized she had been tricked. She started crying and tried to run away, but Albert grabbed her and took her to an empty house. There, he killed Mary and threw her body down an old well. Mary's body was found months later, but the police couldn't find the killer until Albert confessed. These confessions showed how systematic and calculated Albert Fish was. He always chose remote locations, places where no one would hear screams. He always used different methods to deceive his victims, and each time he succeeded in trapping them. But what truly shocked the psychiatrists was Albert's motivation for these crimes. During interrogations, he said he did this not only for sexual pleasure, but also for the feeling of power. He said, "When I killed a child, I felt like I became God. I felt like I had absolute power. This feeling was better than anything I had ever experienced. Psychiatrists said Albert suffered from several mental disorders. He was a sexual sadist, meaning he derived sexual pleasure from hurting others. He was also a masochist, meaning he enjoyed torturing himself. He was a cannibal, meaning he ate human flesh. And he was schizophrenic, meaning he had delusions and heard voices that commanded him. But one of the strangest aspects of Albert was his religious beliefs. He believed that God had ordered him to do this. He said he heard voices at night telling him to kill children to save them from sin. He even claimed to be a prophet sent by God to purify the world. In one interrogation, Albert told a psychiatrist, "I am an angel of God. God told me to kill these children because their futures were full of sin. I was saving their souls. I wasn't killing their bodies." The psychiatrist asked, "Then why did you eat their bodies?" Albert smiled and said, "Because God said the sacrifice had to be complete. Both body and soul had to be purified. By eating their bodies, I merged them with myself. They became a part of me and remained pure forever." These justifications showed that Albert truly believed he was doing the right thing. He felt no remorse, no guilt. Instead, he thought he was doing God's work. Another of Albert's horrific crimes was the murder of two brothers named Johnny and Robert, who disappeared in 1926. Albert said he had seen these two brothers playing in a park. Their parents had left for a few minutes to buy food. He approached the boys and said, "Hey kids, do you want to play a fun game?" Johnny, who was 7, asked, "What game?" Albert said, "A game that's over there in the park, a place nobody knows about. It's really fun." Robert, who was 5, said, "But Mom told us to stay here." Albert said, "Don't worry, we'll be back really fast, where Mom won't even notice." The two brothers, curious, went with Albert. He took them to a remote part of the park where there were many trees and no one could see what was happening. When they got there, Johnny realized something was wrong. He said, "There's no game here, you were lying." Albert smiled and said, "No, the game starts right here." Johnny tried to run away with his brother, but Albert caught both of them. He took them to a nearby forest and killed them both. Their bodies were never found, and their parents waited for their sons to return for the rest of their lives. Albert also confessed to the murder of a girl named Ruth, who was killed in 1923. He said he saw Ruth at a church, a girl who had been left alone after the service. Albert approached her and introduced himself as a friend of the family. He said, "Hello, my girl. I'm a friend of your parents. They told me to take you home." Ruth, who was 8, looked at Albert and said, "I don't know you. My dad never mentioned you." Albert said, "That's because we just met. Your dad spoke to me in the church and said I should take you because he has something to do." Ruth was still hesitant, but Albert was so convincing that she finally agreed. Albert took her to his car and drove to an empty house. There, he tortured Ruth for several hours and finally killed her. Ruth's body was found in a river, but the police thought she had drowned and never realized she was a murder victim. These stories showed how calculated and merciless Albert Fish was. He always chose children who could be easily deceived. He exploited the trust of children and their families, and each time he managed to escape. One of the psychiatrists who examined Albert was Dr. Frederick Wortham. After several sessions with Albert, he reported that this man suffered from the most severe mental disorders he had ever seen. Dr. Wortham wrote, "Albert Fish is a demonic entity living in human skin. He feels no remorse, has no understanding that his actions are wrong, and only enjoys the memories of his crimes." Dr. Wortham also reported that Albert had severely tortured himself throughout his life. When Albert's body was examined with X-rays, 29 needles were found in his pelvic region. These needles had been inserted into his body by Albert himself years before, and some were so deep they could no longer be removed. Albert also said that he would beat himself with nail-studded boards and put cotton balls soaked in alcohol on his body and set them on fire. He said, "The pain made me feel alive. When I was in pain, I felt that I was real, that I was a powerful being." These behaviors showed that Albert not only tortured others, but also enjoyed torturing himself. He was addicted to pain, both his own and that of others. Albert had also written a number of letters to various women, letters filled with sexual and violent content. In these letters, he recounted his fantasies that included torture and murder. The police found these letters and realized that Albert had been planning his crimes years before he committed his first murder. In one of these letters, Albert had written, "I want to one day find a child who is completely innocent, a child who hasn't sinned yet, and I want to take that child somewhere where no one is around, and there I want to show them how cruel the world can be." These letters showed that Albert had been thinking about this years before his first murder. He had planned these crimes in advance, and each murder was part of a long-term plan. Another of Albert's victims was a boy named Charles, who was abused in 1924, but managed to escape. After Albert's arrest, Charles informed the police and said a man matching that description had seen him on the street and taken him to a house. There, Albert stripped him and beat him with a rope. Albert said he would kill him if he screamed. Charles said, "I was so scared, I thought I was going to die. But after a while, he got distracted for a moment, and I managed to escape. I jumped out the window and ran as fast as I could." Charles had never reported it to the police because he was too scared. Albert Fish's crimes were not limited to children. In his confessions, he said that he had also abused adults, although he preferred to work with children because they were more vulnerable. He said that in 1925, he had abused a woman named Margaret. Margaret was a homeless woman living on the streets of New York. Albert approached Margaret and said, "Ma'am, I can give you food and a place to sleep if you want to come with me." Margaret, who was hungry and cold, agreed. Albert took her to an empty house, But instead of giving her food, he tied her to a chair and began torturing her. He beat Margaret with a belt, pressed needles into her body, and tortured her for hours. Finally, when he grew tired of the torture, he released Margaret. Margaret, severely injured, reported it to the police, but the police couldn't find Albert. After Albert's arrest, Margaret contacted the police and identified him. She said, "That's the man who tortured me. I will never forget his face." Albert also confessed to a number of attempted kidnappings that had been unsuccessful. He said he had tried several times to abduct children from in front of schools, but parents or teachers had noticed, forcing him to flee. He said, "Sometimes things didn't go right. Sometimes the children screamed or someone came, and I had to let them go and run away." One of these unsuccessful attempts happened in 1927. Albert had tried to take a girl named Helen from in front of her school. He had approached Helen and said her mother had sent him. But Helen didn't trust him and screamed. A teacher ran towards them, and Albert was forced to flee. Helen later gave a description of Albert to the police, but the police couldn't find him. Now that Albert was arrested, all these stories came to light. The police realized that Albert had tried to abduct children many more times, but had failed. These unsuccessful attempts showed that Albert was truly a professional predator. He knew which role worked best in which situation. Another of Albert's horrific crimes was the murder of a boy named William, who was killed in 1924. Albert said he had seen William at a train station, a boy waiting for his father. Albert approached him and said his father had sent him. William said, "My dad sent you? But I don't know you." Albert said, "Your dad is stuck at work. He told me to come get you. He said something urgent came up." William, thinking maybe his father really had sent him, went with Albert. Albert took him to an empty house and killed him. William's body was found in a woods a few weeks later, but the police couldn't find the killer. Albert also confessed to the murder of a girl named Annie, who was killed in 1926. He said he saw Annie in a park, a girl playing alone. Albert approached her and started playing with her. He told Annie he wanted to tell her a secret, and Annie, curious, listened. Albert said, "There's a secret place," and her family waited for years, hoping for her return. These stories showed that Albert Fish was a true serial killer with his own specific methods. He always used psychological tactics to deceive his victims and always chose remote locations to leave no trace of himself. Albert also said he enjoyed eating his victims' flesh. He said, "When I ate a child's flesh, I felt like that child had become a part of me, that we had merged forever." This feeling was very powerful. Psychiatrists said this belief was rooted in Albert's mental disorders. He truly believed that by eating his victims, he merged with them, and this made him feel more powerful. Albert also said he usually cooked his victims' flesh in specific ways. He said, "I usually cooked the meat with vegetables. Sometimes I grilled it, sometimes with lemon juice and spices. It tasted very good." These details were so horrific that even experienced detectives couldn't bear them. One detective resigned after hearing these confessions, saying he could no longer work on such cases. After weeks of interrogation and confession, the police finally understood how Albert Fish had been able to operate for so many years without anyone suspecting him. The story of his arrest and how he was exposed is a fascinating tale in itself. As mentioned, Albert exposed himself by writing the letter to the Budd family. But why did he do it? Why, after 6 years, did he decide to write a letter he knew would lead to his arrest? Albert answered this question during interrogations. He said, "I felt my work was finished. I felt it was time for everyone to know what I had done. I wanted to be famous. I wanted everyone to hear my name." This response showed that Albert was, but the story of his arrest wasn't limited to the letter. Detective William King, the man who had searched for Grace Budd for 6 years, played a key role in Albert's capture. King was an experienced detective who had been working on the case since 1928. He had promised to find Grace, or at least discover what had happened to her. When Albert's letter arrived at the Budd home, King knew this was his chance. He carefully examined the envelope and saw a company logo on it. He went to that company and questioned the employees. The employees said that a few days earlier, an old man had come and taken some envelopes. King asked them to give a detailed description of the man. One employee said he was an old man with a white beard, thin, tall, with gray eyes. He was very polite. I even remember what he was wearing. He had a dark coat and a hat. King compared this description to the one the Budd family had given of Frank Howard. They matched perfectly. King knew he was looking for the same man. He began investigating the area around the workplace, asking anyone he could. Finally, a homeless man told him he knew a man matching that description. The homeless man said, "Yes, I know that old man. His name is Albert. He lives in a rented house a few blocks away. He's a strange man, always alone, always watching children." King immediately went to that address. He surveilled the house and waited for several days. He wanted to be sure he was arresting the right man. Finally, on December 13th, 1934, Albert Fish returned home. King saw him and recognized him instantly. He went to the door with several other officers and knocked. When Albert opened the door, King said to him, "Albert Fish." Albert smiled and said, "Yes, that's me. You're here for me?" King said, "Yes, you are under arrest for the murder of Grace Budd." Albert nodded and said, "Good. I've been waiting for you. Come in." King and the other officers entered the house. It was small and dirty, filled with a smell of rot and something like spoiled meat. Albert led them to the living room and sat on a chair. He seemed calm, even satisfied. King asked, "Why did you send the letter?" "You knew we would find you," Albert said. "Yes, I knew, but it didn't matter anymore. I had done my work. It was time for everyone to know." King said, "You killed Grace Budd." Albert smiled and said, "Yes, I killed her, and many others." "Do you want to know how many I killed?" King was shocked. He didn't expect Albert to confess so easily. He said, "How many?" Albert said, "I don't know exactly. Maybe 15. Maybe more. I don't remember the exact number." King handcuffed Albert and took him to the police station. On the way, Albert began telling his stories. He explained Grace's murder in full detail, then began recounting other murders. King couldn't believe that such a man had lived among people for years without anyone noticing. When they arrived at the police station, Albert was immediately interrogated. Without a lawyer, he began confessing. He told them how he had taken Grace to the empty house, how he had killed her, and how he had dismembered her body. He even said which parts he had eaten and which parts he had buried. The interrogator, who couldn't believe it, asked, "You really ate that child's flesh?" Albert said with a smile, "Yes. It was very delicious. It was the best thing I've ever eaten." The interrogator felt nauseous, but continued. He asked Albert if he had any other victims. Albert said yes, and began listing names. He named Francis McDonnell, Billy Gaffney, and several others. Each time he named someone, he explained the details of the murder. The police realized that Albert was truly a serial killer who had been active for years. They began investigating each of the cases Albert had mentioned. Many of these cases were still open, and the police hadn't been able to find the killer until then. Detective King, who had been waiting for this moment for 6 years, felt a sense of peace. He had finally found Grace Budd's killer, even though Albert had exposed himself. King went to the bar. When Grace's mother heard that her daughter's killer had been arrested, she began to cry. She said, Finally, we know what happened. Finally, we know that our Grace isn't coming back." Grace's father, who had blamed himself for years for allowing Grace to go with that man, now felt rage. He said, "I want to kill that man myself. I want to strangle him with my own hands." But King told him the law will do its job. That man will soon be tried and punished. News of Albert Fish's arrest spread quickly throughout New York and then across America. Newspapers dedicated their front pages to the story. People were shocked that such a man had lived among them for years. Many families with missing children came to the police station to see if their children had been among Albert's victims. The police also began searching Albert's house. They searched every corner. In the basement, they found horrifying things: various knives, torture instruments, ropes, and a box full of letters. These letters were written to various women, and all were filled with sexual and violent content. They also found a notebook in which Albert had written the names of his victims. This notebook contained names, dates, and details of each murder. The police used this notebook to confirm Albert's confessions. One of the things the police found was a bag full of photographs. These were pictures of various children. Some were identified and found to have been Albert's victims, but many were never identified, leaving the question of whether those children had also been Albert's victims. The police also excavated the woods where Albert said he had buried Grace's body. They found bones that were confirmed to belong to Grace Budd. This was the first time the Budd family could bury their daughter and hold a funeral for her. Grace's funeral was attended by hundreds of people. They came from all over New York to pay their respects. The Budd family, who had waited years for this moment, could now mourn for Grace and lay her to rest. But the story wasn't over. Albert still had to be tried, and his trial became one of the most sensational trials of the 20th century. After Albert Fish's arrest, the New York District Attorney decided to prosecute him for the murder of Grace Budd. They could have tried him for other murders as well, but the Grace Budd case was the strongest because Albert himself had written a letter to the family detailing everything. Albert Fish's trial began on March 10th, 1935. The courtroom was filled with reporters, detectives, and the victims' families. Everyone wanted to see what this man was like. The man who had committed so many horrific crimes. When Albert entered the courtroom, he looked like an ordinary old man. He was small and thin, had a white beard, and walked calmly. If someone saw him on the street, they would never imagine he was a serial killer. Albert's lawyer, James Dempsey, decided to base his defense on insanity. He argued that Albert suffered from severe mental disorders and did not know his actions were wrong. He said, "My client is a sick man. He suffers from mental illnesses that started in his childhood. He needs treatment, not punishment." But the prosecutor, Alvin Schaff, argued that Albert knew exactly what he was doing. He said, "This man planned for years. He used various methods to deceive his victims. After each murder, he hid the body and fled. This shows he knew his actions were wrong and wanted to escape the law." The trial lasted 10 days. During this time, various witnesses came to court. The Budd family came and told the story of the day Albert took Grace. Grace's mother, who still couldn't believe her daughter was dead, said through tears, "I let my daughter go with that." Grace's father also testified. He said, "That man came to our house, ate with us, talked with us, and did all that to gain our trust. And then he took my daughter and killed her." Detective King also testified. He told the story of his 6-year investigation and how he finally managed to find Albert. He also showed the judge the letter Albert had written to the Budd family. This letter was the most important evidence against Albert. Next, psychiatrists came to court. Dr. Frederick Wortham, the psychiatrist who had examined Albert, said, "Albert Fish suffers from the most severe mental disorders I have ever seen. He suffers from sadism, masochism, cannibalism, and schizophrenia. He has delusions and hears voices." Dr. Wortham also said, "Albert believes God ordered him to kill children. He thinks he is doing the right thing. This indicates he is insane." The prosecutor brought another psychiatrist who disagreed. Dr. Charles Lambert said, "It's true that Albert Fish suffers from mental disorders, but he fully knows his actions are wrong. He managed to hide his crimes for years. He used various methods to deceive his victims. This shows he has the capacity to distinguish right from wrong." Dr. Lambert continued, "Albert Fish is an evil man, not an insane man. He enjoys his crimes and feels no remorse." After the psychiatrists' testimonies, it was Albert's turn. He took the witness stand and began telling his story. He explained Grace's murder in complete detail. He told how he took her to the empty house, how he killed her, and how he dismembered her body. As he was telling this story, many in the courtroom couldn't bear it. Some left, others started crying. But Albert continued with complete calm. He even smiled as he recounted the details. The judge asked him, "Do you feel any remorse?" Albert thought for a moment and said, "No, I don't feel remorse. I think I did the right thing. I saved those children from sin." This answer shocked everyone in the courtroom. Even Albert's own lawyer couldn't believe he was saying such a thing. The prosecutor asked Albert, "Did you know that murder is wrong?" Albert said, "Yes, I knew. People think it's wrong, but I knew God wanted me to do it." The prosecutor said, "So you knew that if you were caught, you would be punished?" Albert said, "Yes, I knew, but it didn't matter. I had to do God's work." These conversations showed that Albert fully knew his actions were wrong, but he did them anyway. For the prosecutor, this was sufficient proof that Albert was not insane, but a conscious criminal. After 10 days of trial, the jury went to a private room to deliberate. They took only 4 hours to reach a verdict. When they returned, the judge asked them, "Have you reached a verdict?" The jury foreman said, "Yes, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Albert Fish, guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom fell silent. Albert, sitting in his chair, showed no reaction. He just shook his head, as if he had expected it. And the judge said to Albert, "Albert Fish, you have been convicted of the first-degree murder of Grace Budd, and your sentence is death by electrocution." Albert smiled and said, "Okay, I'm ready." This reaction shocked everyone. Even his lawyer couldn't believe Albert was so calm. But Albert later told his lawyer that he was not afraid of death, but was waiting for it. After the trial, Albert was transferred to Sing Sing prison in New York. He was held in solitary confinement, awaiting the execution of his death sentence. But even in prison, he exhibited strange behaviors. Albert Fish was held in the death row section of Sing Sing prison. He lived in a small cell and was alone for hours every day. But he wasn't afraid of solitude. He enjoyed it. He said that in solitude, he could talk to God. The guards said Albert was a strange prisoner. He never caused trouble, was always polite, and followed orders. But at night, strange sounds came from his cell. He would sometimes scream, sometimes laugh, and sometimes talk to himself. One guard said, "One night, I was passing by his cell. I heard him talking to someone. I thought there was someone else in the cell. But when I looked, I saw he was alone, talking to himself, or perhaps to something we can't see." In prison, Albert wrote letters to psychiatrists and detectives. In these letters, he revealed more details about his crimes. He wrote that he had killed several other children that the police were unaware of. He even said he had committed crimes in different US states and had never been caught. In one of these letters, Albert wrote, "I think I abused more than 100 children and killed at least 20 of them. But I don't remember the exact number, because after a while, they all start to look the same." These letters prompted the police to reopen investigations. They went to different states and reviewed cases of missing children. But many of these cases were never solved because the bodies weren't found and there was insufficient evidence. Albert also read newspapers in prison. He enjoyed reading news about himself. He saw how the newspapers called him the Brooklyn Vampire and the Brooklyn Monster. He was satisfied with these nicknames because he knew he was now famous. Albert told one of the guards, "I'm famous now. Everyone knows my name. That's exactly what I wanted." The guard asked, "Are you happy that you became famous? You became famous for killing children." Albert said, "It doesn't matter what I became famous for. What matters is that people remember me." These statements showed that Albert not only felt no remorse, but was actually proud of his crimes. Albert's lawyer, James Dempsey, tried to have his death sentence commuted to life imprisonment. He filed an appeal, arguing that Albert was insane and should not be executed. But the appeals court rejected the request, stating that Albert fully knew what he had done. The governor of New York also rejected a plea for clemency. He said, "This man has committed horrific crimes for which there is no justification. He must be punished." Finally, Albert's execution date was set for January 16th, 1936. When Albert heard the news, he smiled and said, "Good, I'm ready. I've been waiting for this moment." ... On the day of the execution, Albert woke up early. He ate a simple breakfast and then allowed the prison chaplain to pray with him. The chaplain later said that Albert was very calm during the prayer and even smiled. At 11 p.m., the guards came to Albert's cell. They told him it was time to go. Albert got up without any resistance and went with them. Along the way, he talked to them as if he were going on a normal outing. When they reached the execution chamber, Albert saw the electric chair. He smiled and said, "This is very interesting. I always wanted to know what the electric chair feels like." The guards strapped him into the chair. They secured his arms and legs with straps and attached electrodes to his head and leg. Albert remained calm throughout and showed no reaction. The warden asked Albert, "Do you have any last words?" Albert thought for a moment and said, "No, I have nothing to say. I just want to know what this feels like." These were Albert Fish's last words. After that, the guard placed a mask over his face. The execution chamber fell silent, and everyone waited. The warden raised his hand, then lowered it. The executioner pulled the lever, and electricity surged into Albert's body. 2,000 volts of electricity flowed through Albert's body for 20 seconds. His body convulsed in the chair, and the smell of burnt flesh filled the air. After 20 seconds, the electricity was cut off. The doctor came forward and checked his pulse. He shook his head, indicating that Albert was still alive. The electricity was turned on again, this time for another 30 seconds. Albert's body convulsed again, and smoke rose from his head. Finally, after 2 jolts of electricity, the doctor declared the time of death was recorded as 11:09 p.m. on January 16th, 1936. Albert Fish, the old man who had killed innocent children for decades, had finally received his punishment, but the story didn't end there. After Albert's death, one of the guards said that Albert had said something strange before the execution. He had told the guard, "I think the electric chair will be the best experience of my life, because I've always enjoyed pain. And this is the greatest pain possible." This statement showed that even in the final moments of his life, Albert was still the same sick and strange man. He even expected to enjoy his own death. After the execution, Albert's body was taken to a medical laboratory for an autopsy. The doctors wanted to find out if his brain showed any signs of physical abnormality. They examined his brain, but found nothing unusual. Albert's brain was like that of a normal human. This finding indicated that Albert's crimes were not the result of physical brain damage, but rather a combination of psychological, social, and environmental factors. Albert had been abused as a child, grew up in a family with a history of mental illness, and lived in a society that ignored mental illness. All these factors had turned him into a monster. After the autopsy, Albert's body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location. His family did not want to claim his body because they despised him. Albert's children, who until then had not known what their father had done, were now faced with the horrible truth. One of Albert's sons later said, "We never thought our father was like that. We thought he was a normal man. Now we have to live with this shame for the rest of our lives." After Albert's execution, his children changed their surname, so no one would know they were the children of Albert Fish. They tried to live normal lives, but the shadow of their father always hung over them. The families of Albert's victims felt a sense of peace after his execution. They knew justice had been served, and the killer of their loved ones had been punished. But nothing could ease the pain of losing their children. After Albert's execution, Grace Budd's mother told reporters, "I'm glad that man is dead, but it doesn't bring my daughter back. I think about my daughter every day and wish I hadn't let her go with that man." Grace's father said, "I will blame myself for the rest of my life, but at least now I know that man can't harm another family." The story of Albert Fish became one of the darkest criminal stories of the 20th century. It showed how a human can turn into a monster and how society can ignore the warning signs. Many psychiatrists studied Albert's case after his death. They tried to understand what made him the way he was. They concluded that Albert suffered from multiple mental disorders that combined to make him a serial killer. One psychiatrist wrote, "Albert Fish is a perfect example of a serial killer who feels no remorse. He enjoys his crimes and is even proud of them. This type of criminal is the most dangerous because they offer no hope for rehabilitation." The story of Albert Fish also led to new laws for child protection. After his case, the police and authorities realized they needed to be more vigilant and pay attention to warning signs. They also began educating parents and teachers on how to protect children from predators. But despite all these efforts, the story of Albert Fish is a reminder that monsters are real and they can hide behind the face of an ordinary person. They can live among us for years, and we might not even realize who they are.